or some introduction, I should say, to Dr. Brown's presentation. He's the General Manager Development and Corporate Affairs for New Zealand Energy Corporation, and may be known to some of you through his involvement in the Westtech exploration around Wairoa over the last decade or so. We met and Dr. Brown presented his outline of the proposal for exploration that New Zealand Energy Corporation have in the Wairoa area. We thought it would be helpful and useful for him to come and present that to the Council, to explain what they are planning to do. So he is going to run us through a PowerPoint presentation that hopefully Leanne has loaded on to the system, and take questions. I've also provided in the paper just some clarification or background around the processes or the statutory parts of the Council that will pick this up. So my suggestion is we just crack into the presentation.
Thank you. Well, as I introduced Dr. Brown, I have known him for a few years. He has been, how do you say this, current in exploration activity in Wairoa for some years now, and it's good to catch up with you again and welcome you presenting to us here today. So just if you could use your microphone, please, Mr. Brown, would be great, and welcome.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Council, for the invitation to come and present to you today and to introduce our East Coast project to a wider audience. So I think Ian introduced that we have started discussions with Council around consenting requirements for our exploration activities in the Wairoa area. Just a bit of background. New Zealand Energy Corp is a young company. It was started up in 2010 in British Columbia in Canada. Made its first application for a petroleum exploration permit to the New Zealand Government in 2010, and in late 2010 it was awarded a permit over an area we call the Castle Point permit, obviously in the Wairarapa, southern east coast. So the company has brought in Canadian expertise into the New Zealand exploration scene, but equally importantly brought in capital from North America. Just a bit of background. My academic qualifications are in geology and in engineering. I have a Doctor of Engineering degree in rock mechanics from the University of California at Berkeley. But for some 26 odd years I ran a small consulting group out of Wellington, providing services in geology, geophysics, engineering to resource-based industries around New Zealand. One of our clients was a company called Westtech Energy New Zealand, who had an exploration permit or permits around the East Coast area, including Hawke's Bay, over a number of years. From 1994, my company managed their New Zealand operations, and it included a number of wells that were drilled in the Wairoa area, and the slide up on the screen shows one of those wells, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. In February 2011, New Zealand Energy Corp acquired certain assets from my company, E&R Brown Associates Limited, and 8 of us transferred our employment to NZEC. In mid-2011, the company went through an initial public offering on the Canadian Venture Exchange and raised significant capital. So over the last 18 months or so, we've raised around about 130 million Canadian dollars. In August 2011, the first oil production was underway in Taranaki following some successful exploration there. But before I move on from this slide, this is showing a well that was drilled just a little north of Wairoa. In 1998, it was a site we called Awatiri, and you can see township of Wairoa, the industrial area in the background. It's on the road leading out to Frasertown, quite close to houses. But as you can see, if I got a pointer, yeah, here we go. This is the main rig floor here with the mast where the rods get stacked. The well's drilled immediately under here. There's a rotary table that turns the rods, turns the bit, and the well advances. As the well is drilled, the rock cuttings come up to the surface flushed out with a mud system, and they go through a separator shaker system here so that the rock cuttings end up in a pit and are taken away and disposed. The mud goes through, gets reconditioned and reused back into the well. Around the site you can see these big pumps that are used for pumping the mud. We have accommodation units. Staff generally stay on site during the 24-hour drilling cycles. And across here we've got tanks that contain cement, which is used for cementing the steel casing into the wellbore. So quite a compact operation. It's a short-term activity that takes place as quickly as possible. It's an expensive operation, so we don't want to be dallying around. Once the well is completed, cased, the gear is taken away from the site, and if we've got a successful well, then we can start testing it. Right, I'm not going to expect you to read this, but as I said, we are a public company, so anything that I tell you today, you should not use for investment purposes. Further background to what we're doing in New Zealand. Most of our activity has been around the Taranaki region, and our first discovery was in a permit right in the middle of this bunch of permits here, Kopamoki, and we've been producing gas and oil from I think it's a total of 10 wells now. So we've got ongoing production cash flow, which is funding our exploration activities. So on the east coast, we have 3 permits. We have quite a large permit that was recently granted here. We call it the East Cape permit, the Wairoa permit that will be subject of discussion today, and the original application, the first application made over this Castle Point permit. And we have plans to drill wells in each of these 3 East Coast permits through this year. The other takeaway from this slide is you can see a number of red and green dots around the East Coast, and they are oil seeps and gas seeps. I think there's around 300 of those, and many of them have been typed back to a source rock, which is the subject of our exploration. And this is about as technical as I'll get with the geology, but it's what we call a stratigraphic column. We're looking at the rocks from near surface down to depth. The youngest rocks at the top, getting older as we get deeper. The previous exploration activities around Wairoa and certainly on the east coast have been targeting these yellow rocks up at what we call mid-Miocene. So they're relatively young rocks, sands and limestones that provide a reservoir to contain oil and gas that's migrated from depth. In recent years, there's been a lot of attention paid to producing oil and gas from the source rocks. So these are rocks at much greater depth, much older rocks, and these are extensive over the east coast. They're the Waipawa shale and the Whongai shale. And as I mentioned, the oil and gas has been the seep to the surface. Using geochemical techniques, we can show that they originated in these shales.
Question on that side before you go off it. You've got the age of the rocks there, but can you give us an indication of the depths we're talking about?
It varies. Some of these shales outcrop, they're at the surface, so they are exposed, and in the deeper parts of the basin they can be 5,000-6,000 metres deep. So we're targeting them around about 3,500 metres, so that they are in what we call the oil window. And I'll move on to another slide to explain a little bit about how that works. Here's one of the shales. This is an outcrop, so clearly there's no cover on it, and any oil and gas that may have been in that shale has probably escaped, although we do see traces of it. Because it's quite rich in organic material, and these are some of the numbers that we look for, total organic content 2 to 6% and up to 12%. As these rocks are buried deep, it's like putting organic material into a pressure cooker. We cook them up because there's a geothermal gradient that heats the rocks, and we put them under great pressure, and that allows chemical reactions to take place and oil and gas to be liberated from the organic material. So as I mentioned, these are the source rocks for the oil and gas that we see around the east coast. What we are targeting is to drill into these rocks, create fractures. This is the terminology you've probably heard, hydraulic fracturing. It opens these rocks up to allow the oil and gas that's in very, very small pores, micro pores, that allows that to be returned to the surface. Looking at the petroleum exploration permit around the Wairoa area, this was granted in July 2006 to Westech. New Zealand Energy Corp, or NZEC Wairoa, which is a subsidiary of the New Zealand Energy Corp, has taken an 80% interest in the permit. Bit of background, Westech, as you may well know, drilled a number of wells. There were 12 exploration wells between 1998 and 2007. Here's the results of one of them. This was the first well that was drilled, called Kaharoa 1. It was drilled on a property called Spring Hill Station, which the chairman would be very familiar with. And there was quite a lot of gas tested under an initial test. Subsequent testing, the gas watered out. It was in a complex fractured limestone reservoir, and it was deemed not commercial to produce from that one. But we are going deeper than this well. The other wells in the area were relatively shallow. We'll be drilling to a greater depth to investigate the shales. The permit area is shown on this slide. Just to give you your bearings, Hawke's Bay Regional Council the boundary cuts across the top of the permit, so the majority of the permit is within this council's jurisdiction. Showing some of the previous activities that have taken place over the permit. These blue lines are seismic lines that were shot by Petrocorp back in the 80s. Red lines, seismic lines shot by Westech as part of their exploration activities. And then you can see the black dots with a number of wells. These wells around here were drilled by Westech. There's some older wells drilled in this area back in the 20s and 30s, I believe, Opatama in the 60s. So there's been sporadic exploration activity through this area in the past, and enough encouragement to keep people coming back. More recently, early last year, as part of our activities, we've shot some more seismic lines. These are the orange lines in this area around Whareroa and across this area to the west. Looking at some more of the detail, I think there's some, here we are. We're going to show you a seismic line that's WEC8, which runs along the coast. It's this, well, along the state highway. In fact, it was shot using vibro-size. So it's a line that something like that. And we are proposing a well somewhere in this area called Omatarangi 1. Now, here's the view of the seismic line. Just to give you a quick background into how seismic data is acquired. Simple shallow shot holes, explosives are let off. The energy that's generated travels down through the Earth's crust and is reflected off various layers. And those reflections come back to the surface and are collected with very sensitive geophones and recorded. A lot of computing horsepower goes into taking that information and creating a two-dimensional, in this case, view of those reflectors. And based on the reflectors, our geophysicists are able to trace out the various layers in the subsurface. So this is giving you a bit of a regional overview of the northern part of Hawke's Bay, where we've got these bumps in the subsurface. Tunanui sandstone was one of the targets of Westech drilling, and you can see they've located it here with a well at Tuhara. Near top of a bump is a trapping mechanism for oil and gas. They went across to another well, Opaho, here, and you can see they've gone for another bump. And there's another well, Opatama, out here, looking at the same sorts of features. Now, our exploration activities will be looking at the deeper layers. This is the top of the Waipawa shale. None of these earlier wells were drilled into it, but we can correlate it with the Opatama well and follow it at depth. So we'll be looking at drilling into it into the oil window. So we expect at that sort of depth that there will be enough pressure and enough temperature that oil will have been generated. So the program moving forward is to drill in a vertical exploration well, and it's around about 3,500 metres deep. Some of the drilling parameters we will be looking at, and because of the nature of the rocks, we will need to stimulate it to show that we've got movable hydrocarbons. So the next steps, we need to obtain land access agreement. We're working on that now. We need to complete our assessment of environmental effects. That's underway. We will continue our consultation with iwi and potentially affected parties. We have been in constant discussion with iwi over our activities, and then we have some consents to apply for. At the same time, we are looking for a partner to come in and help fund this activity. It is reasonably high risk, and it's quite common in the oil and gas industry that the opportunity is farmed out to other people to participate. So we're actively looking for partners at the moment. So to wrap it up, here's our contact details, and we look forward to working in your region in the near future.